ahead and prepare to go live. So again, best practices are to mute yourself and turn your camera off. When you do want to speak, please turn your camera on and then unmute yourself. And we do max out at 6 camera feeds at a time.
Okay, it is 11:30, and this is the April 28th.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, let me start that over. So today is April 28th, and this is the meeting of the City Finance Committee. This is our first one through the new online system. So, Ms. Clerk, if you could do a roll call vote, please. A roll call, please.
Certainly. Councilmember Friedman?
Here.
Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez?
Here.
And Councilmember Harmon?
Here.
Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So today we're going to be looking at our solid waste, wastewater, and water rates, and a preliminary look at the schedule for the upcoming budget season. So with that, I will turn it over to our finance director and to go over the presentation for the water and wastewater and solid waste rates.
Good morning, Chair Friedman, committee members. I'm Jennifer Tomaszewski, the interim finance director. And for my presentation today, really I'm going to be focusing on the general fund major revenues. Typically each year we bring to your committee a deeper dive into our general tax revenues, which in turn we look at the trends and how those are forecasting, because those really set the tone for how our general fund budget's going to, what our general fund budget's going to look like. As we set the tone last week, looking at the kind of pre-COVID and post-COVID, I'm going to be doing similar presentation today as well. Normally, we would be also bringing to you the multi-year forecast as part of this, because we're having, because we're really trying to figure out what the shorter term look is going to be, and there's so many unknowns right now. We've removed that as part of the presentation at this time. But then we've also added on a couple housekeeping items at the end of this presentation as well. When I'm finished going through the revenues, I'll hand it over to Brandon Bodette. He's our budget manager, and he's going to do a couple. He has a couple slides as well. And if we could go to the next slide. Yeah. So again, as we presented last week, we will be looking at sales tax, property tax, TOT, how those are tracking this year, kind of pre-COVID and after. And then the last two items, Brandon will be, or Mr. Bodette will be presenting. So these next two slides that you're going to be looking at. So first, this one is the same slide that we saw last week. And I'm trying to just keep the numbers similar, even though they're kind of moving targets right now. But this is, again, the $1.8 million surplus that we were forecasting pre-crisis, with a 2% moderate growth going into fiscal year 21. Now, and just to remind you, prior to the impacts of COVID-19, we were seeing that sales tax, property tax, TOT, they were tracking pretty close to budget in fiscal year 20. And with moderate growth going into next year, and just to remind you that the reason for the surplus is it's a combination of the departments being in a deficit and department revenues offset by a one-time reimbursement from Edison for the Thomas fire. So again, the takeaway here is prior to this, even though it was one-time money, we were looking at a little bit of a surplus at the end of 20 and going into 21. And now if we can look at the next slide. And this is also the same slide from last week, where now we're looking at a different scenario and looking at those losses. What's different now with this presentation is I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of those tax revenues. So we'll be looking at these a little more in depth on the next slides. So first, I'm going to talk about sales tax, and with the context of about a $4 million loss estimated for the COVID crisis. And I'm sorry, go to the next slide. And about a $3.5 million loss going into 21. Next slide, please. Thank you. But before I do that, I was just going to give you a little bit of background on the sales tax program and how it operates, how the city receives its funds, and so on. So there are sales taxes levied on the sale of most goods. So as businesses sell their products and collect sales tax, for every dollar sold, the city gets what we refer to as the Bradley-Burns regular sales tax. We get 1% or 1 cent off of every dollar. And then we also have the Measure C sales tax, which is also another 1%. But Measure C is earmarked for infrastructure and capital projects such as streets and so on. But it operates very much like regular sales tax. So the city gets monthly payments from the state. The agency that oversees sales tax is the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, or CDTFA. So they pay jurisdictions monthly based on historical prior amounts that we've received from our unique portfolio of sellers, you may say. And then we have a quarterly true up. So those true ups are where we really see the impacts, because those prepayments or estimates are based on historical payments. So they don't show a true picture of how businesses are operating currently. So for example, the quarter ended December, we received the true up payment in February. So when we're looking at where we're at now, and we know the impacts of the shutdown order started to take effect in March, we're really not going to see those true ups until the end of May. And then similarly, April, May, and June true ups, we won't see those until we get out to the end of August. We do accrual accounting for those revenues each year. So all that means is that we will recognize those losses in fiscal year 20. It's in our books. But prior to that, just again, looking at the background in how sales tax was performing pre-COVID, we were actually seeing growth over the last few years, with more businesses or with more purchases, from online sales. The brick and mortar stores were the sales tax that they were collecting, it was somewhat stagnant. And then in I want to say 2019, when the state started regulating the sales or online sales and taxing them, that's where we started to see a more steady growth in our sales tax and Measure C again. So prior to this, sales tax was actually tracking a little bit better than we had estimated in the past. So we can go to the next slide. And now we're looking at the impacts post-COVID. Well, being a tourist destination, we know that the two biggest revenue sources that are being hit are sales tax and our bed tax, or transient occupancy tax, which we'll be talking about in this presentation as well. But the impacts of this are significant. When we look at the different sectors, one of the processes we go through when we're working with the consultants and looking at our unique makeup in Santa Barbara and what kind of businesses operate here. A big portion of our revenues come from restaurants, retail, and auto sales, all which have been hit significantly. But we look at the different sectors, and so we know the sectors that have been hit hard are the sectors that are the largest revenue generators for our particular city. And we know that they're offset somewhat by food sales, online. We know online sales is going to help. We just don't know, we won't know for several months how much the shift to online sales kind of softens the blow, so to speak. And then we know that we're kind of in the middle of the worst of it right now with a gradual increase going into next year. And to help put a visual to that, if you could go to the next slide. When we're working with our consultants, and then we're also working with, we're reaching out to the professional organizations for government finance. That would be the GFOA, or the Government Finance Officers Association, and the League of Cities, where we're talking about how California is being affected in these different segments, and then how certain, especially a lot of the beach cities that are more tourist based, how they're impacted as well. And so I broke that down for you. And this, it also shows, a week ago we were saying probably about 4 million in fiscal year 20 and probably 3.5 million in fiscal year 21. When I show you the ranges by the different sectors, you can see in a week's time, we've already, that number's kind of a moving target. So sales tax might be a little bit better off going into next year. Whereas TOT, maybe it's the opposite. Maybe TOT might be even worse next year than we were originally forecasting. And I'm not going to go through each of these just in order to save some time, because we do have a busy agenda today. But just to talk you through the first one, the way that we're looking at our losses is, so for example, the different sectors. So for the first one, general retail, there's actually subsectors within each of those groupings. So we have apparel, department stores, drugstores, and so on. And then you see a really wide range. Well, 45 to 90%, that's a pretty big range. We know some apparel stores are shut down completely, whereas, there's some, Target was still open and people were still going there. So, and then looking at 21, we're making the assumptions that there's going to be somewhat of a transition in that first quarter next year, and then more of a traditional scenario of a recession in the last 3 quarters. So that's where we've come up with these ranges. They're fairly consistent with how, just in conversations with other cities and with our consultants and so on. So this is kind of our best shot in the dark at this point. I have 2 more slides. If we could go to the next slide. This is a historical look at our sales tax from 2013 to 2021. You see the orange bars, those are the actual historical sales tax. We see a blip in 2018 and then an increase in 19. A lot of that's some timing differences when the state switched from the Board of Equalization to the CDTFA. So it was really just the timing of monies that we received in 19 that should have been attributed to 18 revenues. And then the 2 green bars, those are our forecast for the end of 20 and going into 21 pre-COVID. And then the red bars are the impacts of the shutdown. And you see that's about a 16% decline in our sales tax revenues this year and about 8% next year. And then on the next slide, I have a similar slide for Measure C. It just doesn't go back as far because it's a newer tax, but it shows the impacts a little bit. It's a little bit more visual impact. And then what this doesn't take into consideration, if we could go to one more slide, just the last thing that I wanted to bring up with regard to sales tax is that this doesn't factor in the state offering deferral of sales tax revenue to businesses. So there's kind of 2 programs that they're offering, one being a 90-day extension to file sales tax returns, for certain small businesses. And then another layer of that is an additional up to $50,000 in sales tax deferral for 12 months for certain small businesses as well. So we don't estimate that that is going to be as big of a hit, but really it's a timing issue as far as cash flows. We're still anticipating getting the majority of that. What am I trying to say? The only other thing I would add here is that, you know, businesses that go out, it's likely that there will be some businesses that don't survive this. And it's what's unknown is the collectability on those. So there's likely a good chance that some of these will be losses to the city as well. And that's it for sales tax. So unless you have any questions, I will move on to property taxes. But if I haven't answered anything, feel free to jump in.
Are there any questions from my colleagues? Hearing none, if you would continue, Ms. Tomaszewski.
Okay. So next is property taxes, and property tax is an annual tax based on the value of real and some personal property. It's set at about 1% of the value of the assessment value, and the tax is used to fund county, school, local jurisdictions. Of the assessed values of all of the properties within the city limits, the city collects about 12% of that. The county facilitates the property tax program and distribute the revenues to the local jurisdictions. I won't ask the proctor to go back to that table, but the first table that we presented last week had it showed a growth of about 5.4% going into fiscal year 21. You can refer back to that later if you like. Let's see. Yeah, so the third line down, property tax, you see the 5.4% growth going into next year's budget. Thank you. Let me go back to okay. So that growth assumes, well, I should go back and just say, if we're looking at historical averages, that growth has stayed between 5 and 7.8% over the last, since 2013 and on. And there's kind of there's three prongs to that. Each year there's a cap of a maximum of 2% growth or CPI. That also folds in new property sales. And then there's also the Prop 8 catch-up adjustment. And what that is back in during the Great Recession, because it was mortgage-based or it was really central around property values. The assessor's office reduced property sales unilaterally in different areas within the tax rate areas. And then as time or over time, they've been very conservative in bringing those property values back up to their pre-recession values. And so we've been seeing a little bit of the incremental growth each year because of that 5.4%. And then in addition to that, the city is the county participates in the teeter program. And what the teeter program is it's a mechanism to, it has to do with delinquent property tax payments, whereas the county, when they provide the assessed values out to the jurisdictions who receive property tax, they pay that amount to those jurisdictions, whether those property taxes are paid on time or not. And then the county collects the delinquent payments and keeps that the penalties and interest on that. It's good for the cities in that it provides more of a steady, easier to forecast revenue stream. So even though there are, there's talk with the state about deferring penalties, and actually the county has agreed to participate in that, where there are certain taxpayers who, may pay their property taxes late. That's not going to impact the city's revenues this year. We can go to the next slide. So when we're looking at the impacts of post-COVID to property tax, it's really limited because of the teeter program. We're sort of already locked in. The property tax values are set in January each year for the April and December payments. And if there were to be some impact as far as recession and a decision down the road to devalue those property assessed values, likely that wouldn't happen for a couple years. There's a delay if that's to happen at all. Where we would see now is the supplemental taxes. So when properties sell right now, there's that third bill you get when you purchase, when you buy a home, for example, where they're readjusting the property values outside of that annual tax roll. And we're not expecting the continuation of the Prop 8 values and with a flat CPI. So essentially, we're not reducing those assessed values in our assumptions, but we're bringing down that assumed growth. And I think this next slide shows that a little bit more visual, where you see the blue graph is the forecast and the orange is with the growth and in fiscal year 21. And then in 20, I think we did ratchet that back a little bit, assuming that for supplemental sales that they just aren't happening during the remainder of the year, that property sales are being impacted. So that's that surplus, supplemental tax revenue. So that's really it for property taxes. And I'll turn it back to you and see if you have any questions before I move on.
Any questions for Ms. Tomaszewski? Hearing none, if you continue on with TOT.
Okay, thank you. So kind of the three largest revenues being property taxes is our largest, then sales tax, transient occupancy tax, or TOT, sometimes we hear bed tax, is our third largest revenue. And we also see this as likely the biggest hit because of the shutdown. So a little bit of background in our TOT. At the city, we have a 12% tax, which is charged to guests. 10% goes to the general fund, 2% goes to creeks. The taxes are collected directly from the hotel owners and remitted to the city monthly. The growth over the last few years has remained around 3%. There's been some new hotels open, and so that's increased the occupancy. And when we're looking at our revenues, we always look at both the occupancy and the daily room rates to get the full story of what's going on in the economy and particularly in the city. But then we also have had to adjust for the decline in short-term rentals as well due to recent efforts for enforcement on that. So even though revenues were up more on the hotel side, we were assuming some additional losses in vacation rentals as those kind of slowly dissipate. But on average, we were seeing about a 3% growth. And then go to the next slide. As I stated, the travel industry's been hit hard with the shutdown. We're seeing reduced occupancy as well as lowering those rates, and we are assuming that the losses are going to be hit hardest right now. I think we're in the worst of it right now, but the hardest part is what that slow recovery is going to look like. And so similar to the sales tax slide, I added in, if we could go to the next slide, a couple scenarios to show how we can forecast what next year is going to look like. So if you look in fiscal year 20, those percentages in white, those are the actual percentage increases or decreases that we were seeing. It's the actual results up through February. And then we get to March, we had originally assumed in scenario 1 about an 80% revenue loss for the remainder of the year. And then with March results coming in, March actually ended up with about a 60% loss, but we think that that April, May, and June are going to be hit even harder. So even with changing those percentages, you see that the dollar amount is pretty incremental, between 5.2 and 5.4 million loss this year. But and when I look at the scenario 1 and 2 in fiscal year 21, they aren't tied to the scenarios this year. It's just giving a couple perspectives looking out into what 21 could look like. So again, that same logic of July, August, September being a transition quarter, and then a 5% decrease for the remainder of the year, maybe a typical recession. Whereas if we were to expect maybe that transition is going to take a little bit longer, and then ending the last 6 months of next year, if we were to take a worst case recession of, say, maybe 8% decline and double that, what it could look like. So I think this gives a much bigger range. And originally we were looking at about $3 million loss going into 21. So, as we get more information, I'm not saying that scenario 2 is now more likely. I'm saying that I guess this is just information to you to show how difficult it is to really forecast what 21 is going to look like. And when we look at this, we really do have to look at it in a range of numbers. So now we're seeing, maybe sales tax is going to do a little bit better, but maybe TOT might do a little, it's probably going to be somewhere within that range. And then I have one more slide that shows what that loss would look like each year based on what I presented last week, the 5.4 million and the $3 million loss going into fiscal year 21. So as you can see, it's just really hard to, unfortunately, we don't have that crystal ball and we can't look out to see, what that future is going to look like. It's really going to be based on consumer and, how inclined travelers are going to be and how fearful they are into traveling when all of the restrictions loosen up and the economy opens back up again. I'm sorry, somebody speaking? Okay. So that's it for TOT. If you have any questions, feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Ms. Tomaszewski. I just want to say thank you for the work that you and staff are doing on this. I know the numbers are constantly changing, and it is a very tough task that you have before you to try to give us accurate data when there's so many variables going in, but just really appreciate what you're doing. So before I open up to my colleagues for questions or comments, I'm going to ask Ms. Gorman if there are any members of the public who wish to speak to this item.
Yes, Chair Friedman, we have Josiah Close who is online. Mr. Close, there are a couple items on this agenda. If you would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand within the app. And Councilmember Friedman, I do not see that he's doing so. So Mr. Close, please raise your hand when we get to the item you wish to speak on. And that's the only public speaker, Mr. Friedman.
Thank you, Ms. Gorman. So I will open it up to my colleagues for any questions on TOT or any other questions or comments regarding the projected revenues coming forward. Councilmember Harmon or Gutierrez? Councilman Harmon.
No, none for me. I just also, I think, echo your comments earlier that this is complicated and really appreciate the work, and looks like there's a lot ahead of us. So that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez.
No comments. Just wanted to say thank you for all your hard work and for this presentation. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I
Great.
think,
Well,
yeah.
go ahead.
Go ahead. You first.
Well, I was just gonna again thank you, and it looks like we have a range of projections. So I know that you're constantly updating those and working with some of our partners to get that accurate data, and
Yeah.
and for each meeting, and we'll do the best we can to base our decisions based on the data as it's changing.
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest part is, it's finding that mix of, where do we react and respond now, and where do we wait, and how deep do we go with cuts now, or, waiting because you don't want to cut too much and then it materializes better than we had hoped, but there's just, it's unprecedented. So. And really, so those were the three main revenues. Now, as we start looking at some of the smaller revenues, I'm going to go through them a little bit quicker. And I will say that we've spent less time focusing on some of the smaller revenue sources because we've tried so hard to really focus on the bigger ones as we're looking at what this means to our budget for specifically for the general fund. But there is some interesting information, at least I think, being a numbers nerd myself, when we look at the utility users tax and franchise fees. What I find interesting is that our consultants are really leery to forecast on UUT revenues right now. We have several line items within our utility users tax, being telephone, cable television, electric, gas, water, solid waste. Each of these have their own individual unique, I guess they operate very independent of one another. And whereas the UUT is a tax levied on the ratepayers themselves, franchise fees operate, they tend to trend similar to the UUT. The franchise fees are charged to the operators. Different mechanism, but they trend closely. So if we could go to the next slide. So the effects of UUT and franchise fees on as a result of the shutdown. These are just really hard to forecast right now. And what we have seen is a shift from commercial to residential. Commercial tends to be a larger source of revenue than the residential side, but there aren't really models to follow. So when I look at the kind of the information that's out there, a lot of people are looking to Italy and what are they seeing in Italy so far. And what we have seen, what's being reported in early reports is that there's an overall decrease of approximately 18% to utilities so far. How does that translate, for us? I guess the best I can say is that it's information, it's useful information as we develop our own models here in the United States. When we're looking at ours in Santa Barbara, our makeup of our utility, our UUT revenue, gas, electric, water, and refuse make up about 68% of that total revenue. So it's likely there will be decreases there. And if we're using that, the same model as Italy, to put a little bit of context to that, we generate about $7 million a year in total UUT to the general fund. The streets fund gets half as well, so $14 million in total $7 million to the general fund. And then when we look at different sectors such as cable, telecom, their data usage, it's actually increasing, but that makes up only about 32% of our total revenues. So we expect that, I guess the main takeaway is that we're probably going to be seeing impacts to our UT revenues and franchise fees as well. But the big unknown is how the utility operators are going to respond. And it may be that there's going to be additional investment in technology and changes to their infrastructure to get ahead of this if this were to happen again, which would in turn increase rates and in turn increase UUT revenues in addition to that. So, and that's really pretty much the main takeaway for UUT at this point. So with that, I'll go to the next slide. And then I just have a couple more slides just to talk about some of the other smaller impacts. So one more slide, the cannabis taxes. I touched on these last week. Cannabis, we're probably going to be seeing increases. I won't repeat all of this other than to say it's a really small portion of our total general fund revenues. We have 2 recreational dispensaries open in fiscal year 20. We have a 3rd coming online in fiscal year 21. And then we also have the manufacturing and distribution as well. So we just don't know what that's going to look like. We've factored in some increase, I think about a 25% increase. We're getting about $1 million this year. But until those businesses open up and we look for that saturation point, we're just not going to know how cannabis revenues or cannabis taxes are going to materialize at this point. But they unfortunately are not going to come save the day. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on business licenses. We know that business license fees are going to be impacted. The way that we set those fees is they're based on the prior 12 months gross sales. So we're not going to see anything necessarily this year, but going in towards the mid to end of 21 is where we'll start seeing as those renewals start to materialize. We do anticipate that we'll see some impacts there. What we don't know is how many businesses are going to survive. But just if we were to look at business licenses historically, about $2.5 million to our general fund budget annually. We have about 16,000 business licenses a year. And that's held pretty steady for at least 10 years. That hasn't changed a whole lot. And then the average growth, so I guess the takeaway here is we still don't know. We know there's going to be some loss. We just don't know until we see the economy open back up and how many businesses survive this. So we do estimate there will be impacts, but again, it's just really hard at this point to estimate how big those impacts are going to be, but still relatively small as far as a revenue source to the general fund. So with that, I'm sorry, I have one more slide for you. And this is a little bit tied to property taxes. We have another source of revenue. In general, it's about $800,000 a year, another small one, but it's property transfer taxes, and it's 55 cents off of every $1,000. It's the document tax fee, or it's a document tax. And this one can swing really significantly from year to year with one large property sale. So it's kind of all over the place anyway. But, if we were to take an average of the last several years, this is about what we'd see. So same as supplemental, we know that the real estate market's been hit, but this is another one we'll be watching as well. And really, that's it for me with the revenues. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. If not, then I can hand it over to Brandon Bodette.
Thank you, Ms. Tomaszewski. My apologies earlier. I had so focused on the 3 big taxes. That's why I had called for public comment. So kind of a new system
that's
for me
okay.
too. So are there any further questions from my colleagues? Seeing none, I'll turn it over to, thank you, Ms. Tomaszewski, and turn it over to Mr. Burdett.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. So today I just wanted to quickly review the Finance Committee's budget review calendar, go over what we'll be talking about over the next 4 weeks, and have the committee approve them, but also I need any additional topics that the committee would like to discuss, so staff can bring those forward as well. So today will be, you heard from about general fund, non-department revenues and assumptions. Next week, the general fund departments will be bringing any proposed fee changes. And there was originally going to be a general fund reserve discussion on the 5th, but that's going to be moved until the following one on May 12th. On May 12th, next slide, the enterprise funds will be bringing their proposed fee changes, and the utility rates will be excluded from that. And any funding requests from outside organizations will also be heard on that particular date. And then we'll wrap up on the 19th. We'll follow up on any items that the committee's requested. We will also be bringing any adjustments to the proposed budget. So anything that's changed from what was filed in April and to what will be recommended in June by staff. And then any decisions that Finance Committee would like to bring forward to Council, we'll bring them all forward into one recommendation and bring that into, bring those forward to Council in June. One more, next slide. I also wanted just to touch on, and this is important for the general public as well, is if anybody wants to find where to find the budget, it's santabarbaraca.gov/budget. You can find everything located in one place there, fee reses, budgets, etc. So with that, I just, if the committee wants to approve the schedule and give me any more additional topics.
Councilwoman Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Thank you, Mr. Bodette. You mentioned that there's going to be some discussion of the general fund reserves, and I personally would be really interested in having a very detailed conversation about the structure of those reserves, as well as how the reserves and our investments have been impacted by this virus. So I just, I don't know to what extent or to what level of detail that conversation about the reserves is going to be included, but I would really like to take a deep dive in that for obvious reasons, I think. So that would be my feedback.
I'll go ahead and jump back in here. We are also bringing the investment report, the quarterly investment report, to the Finance Committee I believe on the 5th as well. And we were going to take that opportunity to go over our liquidity and how our investments have been impacted by all this as well at that time, and as well as the reserves on the 12th as well.
Awesome. And if we can, that sounds great. And if we could just make sure that we have some slides or some conversation about what our reserve policy is, not just how the reserves are doing and the level to which they're funded, but what the policy is, what our capacity is to make use of those funds. I think that's going to be a really important conversation, and speaking for myself only, the more detail I can have about that and how that works at that meeting would be just very, very, very helpful. So
yeah, absolutely. And I believe we will be asking for recommendations from Council as well on our use of reserves.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Gutierrez.
My question was exactly what Megan just asked. You know, a very detailed report on our reserves, just to dive a little bit more into it. So I'm just going to second exactly what Megan just said.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, when all of this originally began, I think one of the first things we did in Treasury is looking at our cash flows and our reserves. And we're meeting on these as well regularly, and with the administration as well. And we'll absolutely be bringing more information to you.
Great. As you say, I will chime in as well on the reserves. I think with my colleagues, I agree wholly that we need to have a really serious and data-driven discussion on the reserves. One thing I'm going to be interested in is what level do we need to maintain our reserves so that we can respond to potential other future disasters, such as if we had a fire later this year or next year. So what it would look like at the different levels as we spend down our reserves, and also understanding the differences between the reserves being used for what they'll be going into next year, because we need to understand what they're going to be for this year, because we will have to spend more this year, but we have other ways to adjust for next year where we don't necessarily have them for this remainder of this fiscal year. So whatever that level is, I think it's important for us to understand what the basic minimum that we need to maintain is. There's another item I wanted to discuss and wanted to hear from my colleagues, is the issue of outside agency requests. Last year, we had a significant number of requests. It was almost unprecedented last year, and the council chose not to fund them. And this year, seeing the numbers that we just had, I am open to not having outside agency requests as part of this year's budget. So I wanted to hear from my colleagues if we wanted to still have that item and have that available, or if we would just like to just say at this point, we don't feel, based on what we had, that we're going to be taking outside agency requests through the finance committee process like last year. Councilman Harmon, you were up first.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Well, as you may remember, I was not a big fan of these outside agency requests last year, even when we had money, and I still feel strongly in that direction. I think it adds unnecessary stress. We're not going to have a surplus. I would strongly support, for the time being, saying we're not taking outside requests. I think that's only fair. And I think it would be fair even if we weren't in the budget circumstance that we find ourselves in. So I would support that action.
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Since I'm new in the finance committee, can you give me a little bit of background with those requests?
Sure. So I can take a crack at this, since myself and Councilmember Harmon were on last year. Or Mr. Casey, I see you're up there. Would you like to chime in?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Friedman and committee members. So oftentimes through the budget process, we would get unsolicited requests from outside entities for funding from the city council. Rarely have we done solicited requests. We used to do that maybe back when we had a redevelopment agency, but since post-redevelopment, these have been unsolicited requests, but we kind of honor them because we need to put them in front of council to decide what to do. And so it is a somewhat awkward dance of bringing them to the finance committee and getting your recommendations and then forwarding them to council. And I think a couple of you mentioned last year, it was a contentious process because we had quite a few that came in. And so far, I think we've only had 2 requests. One was pretty minor. Another is really more affiliated with the waterfront department. I think if you take this action, it sends a clear message to the community that this just isn't the year to consider coming to the council unsolicited for asking for money. And I would support if that's the direction you're going in.
Councilmember Gutierrez, does that answer your questions?
Yes, thank you. And I also agree with Megan. For the moment, right now, from what we're living, I don't think this is the time I don't think we even can, with seeing the reports that we have right now.
Thank you. So I think the direction is clear that we'll remove that item from consideration on I think it was the 12th agenda.
Yes.
So we'll just remove that. And however we want to let the community know, we'll leave that up to staff to work out. So with that, is there anything else from you, Mr. Bodette?
No, that's a clear direction.
And Ms. Gorman was we already went to public comment on this item, so I think we're good on that. So I'll close this item and we'll move on to item 2, which is our solid waste. And also I'm going to, after speaking with staff and watching the Water Commission hearing on the water and wastewater rates, I'm going to ask if we'll combine the presentations for items 2 and 3 today, so that we on finance here get a full picture of the rates. And the reason is that when a customer, as we get their bill, it doesn't get broken down. They're getting one bill. So it's important that we understand the implications of all 3 of these as we have our questions and our comments on what the actual rates and dollars are for our customers. So begin with Ms. Irely, if you'd like to begin with our solid waste, and then we'll go into the water and wastewater presentations after that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chair Friedman and committee members. Today I am going to go through the proposed solid waste rates for fiscal year 21. And in the presentation today, I'll discuss briefly some of the factors affecting revenue and service stability, the components of our revenue requirements, and then the proposed rates for fiscal year 21. Next slide. So obviously we recognize the unprecedented era we are in right now. Then there are several factors that are affecting our revenue and service stability. We provide garbage and recycling collection, processing, and disposal services for the community, waste reduction programs for the community, and Clean SB, which is a suite of services including illegal dumping, litter cleanup, and encampment cleanup. The solid waste fund is approximately $31 million, and 90% of that is associated with long-term contracts. I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. In addition, we have a solid waste reserve, which typically we would use in a year like this to mitigate rates. However, in fiscal year 2018, we used $1.3 million of that reserve to mitigate rates that year. And I will also go into that in a little bit in a couple minutes. Thirdly, as Ms. Tomaszewski was going over, commercial service reduction due to the pandemic is quite extensive. By early April, we are seeing in the neighborhood of 20% reduction in revenue and service levels. We know that this is likely to continue for some time. It's very difficult to model, though we will be watching it closely, but that impacts the overall stability for service providing and also for our fund. And then finally, commercial recyclables, which make up about 1/3 of our total recyclable material, is transitioning from Marburg to the Resource Center for processing per our contract with the county. This is anticipated as part of overall system planning, but it does contribute to the overall increase of our revenue requirements. Next slide. So 2 areas are driving our costs. Again, since 90% of our costs are attached to contracts, these are both in the form of the contract with Marburg for collection, and then the county contract that we have for processing and disposal. Next slide, please. So for collection services, we have a 10-year exclusive agreement with Marburg. This expires in July 2023. And in that agreement, it requires annual compensation increase, which is set by CPI. For this year, that is 2.2%. Next slide. So in December 2016, we entered into a 22-year agreement with the county for recycling and organics processing and disposal. This contract expires in December 2038. We are embarking on the largest public work project in county history. It's state-of-the-art processing. We expect to see upwards of 85% diversion of materials once it's in operation in early 2021, and significant greenhouse gas reductions. To bring this project online, we've had several years of tipping fee increases to ensure adequate capital and operating expenses. The first was in fiscal year 2018, which was increased to $99 per ton. This was the year which the city made the decision to use the reserves to offset rate increases for the community. As you can see, we've been stepping up the tipping fee year over year until this year. This accounts for 4.6% of the overall rate increase, and we do expect this to be leveling off once we're in operation in early 2021. Next slide, please. So to summarize, we are, as I said, recommending a 7% increase this year. Again, to cover collection, which is 2.2%, the processing disposal, 4.6%, and then a small increase associated with our clean SB programming. One of the things that we were adding this year was a full-time code enforcement officer for these services. In our status quo budget, just so you know, which will be seen in a couple of weeks as we go forward, we had an 8% increase. We did eliminate some special projects and city services to provide some relief to the customers, and that's how we came up with the 7% that's before you today. Next slide. So what do these impacts look like? For a typical single-family home, that's the first row, we expect to see a change of about $4 per month per account. The next two row items are small apartment building. Second is small apartment buildings. The last one are large apartment buildings. And we would see an increase of about $3.50 for small apartments, $20 for the large apartment buildings. And just to note that those changes are for the property. So those changes would be spread across the number of units that are at a property. So for example, for a 10 unit apartment, seeing a $20 change per unit would be seeing about a $2 change. Next slide, please. And then similarly on the business side, we would also be seeing increases for typical cart service twice a week, about $33 per month. And then for larger businesses that have, say, a 4-yard bin twice per week, closer to $93 per month. Next slide, please. And just to show you current rate comparisons, these are current rates for this fiscal year across single family service in the South Coast area. You can see that the city of Santa Barbara is in the same neighborhood as the city of Goleta and then neighboring county pockets to the city. We all had the same processing and disposal services and also the same hauler, Marburg. However, there are differences in collection, which impacts some of the variation that you're seeing here. And with that, next slide is the end of my presentation. And I know we're going to wait for questions until the end. So I will be happy to take them then. Thank you.
Mr. Hamilton, you're up.
Thank you, Chair Friedman, members of the committee. Malcolm Hamilton, Administrative Analyst in the Water Resources Division and the Project Manager for Water and Wastewater Rate Setting within the division. Here today to give a presentation on some of the preliminary impacts from COVID on the water and wastewater utilities. So we'll take a quick step back to a couple months ago where the pre-COVID financial planning, and then we'll talk about some of the immediate revenue impacts, largely coming from the commercial sector for the utilities. We'll step you through some different rate planning scenarios where we'll be looking for input from the committee on what our rate plan is going into FY21. And then we'll take a quick moment to talk about the water bill assistance program, which is an effort that we're expediting in the face of the COVID pandemic. And then lastly, just a quick look at what the next steps are. So next slide, please. So a couple months ago for water, what we were planning to do is adopt rates in September and have rates be effective in the October or November timeframe of this year. It was going to be a multi-year adoption. We typically get rates in place for July 1st to coincide with the fiscal year, but there are a couple of data points that we wanted to hold off to have available to us when we set rates, one of which is a water supply agreement with Montecito Water District, which has revenue impacts to the water fund, and also to see in the summer months if we had a rebound in water demand generally. Conservation has remained fairly steady around 30%, and that has a large impact on water rates. So we want to give ourselves more time to get that information and then set rates. We hired HDR Engineering. They're our consultant, and they have initially recommended rate increases of 6%. So we were seeing a step up in some of our capital investment and seeing some operational impacts above standard inflation of about 3.5%. And so that's where that recommendation was coming from. We also had some recommended staffing changes to meet our changing business practices, namely with advanced metering infrastructure budgeted in our capital program. We were going to see some changes to our business units. And we also were planning already to use some available reserves to buffer any rate increases above 6%. Now looking at wastewater, we adopted rates last year. So we would be moving into our second year of rate adoption, and we adopted 3 years of 5% increases. Right now, these 5% increases would go into effect on July 1 of this year, so it would coincide with the fiscal year. And that's the plan as of now, but we'll talk more about how that could change. We also in the wastewater fund have used a good portion of council policy reserves, particularly the capital improvement reserves. And we did that to fund final design for the Ellisdale Electrical Renewal Project. By getting the project to final design, we would make ourselves competitive for SRF funding, so state revolving fund loan funding, which is low interest and highly desirable. And because of that, we would be reimbursed later on, but we had to put some money out up front. And also in wastewater, like water, we have some recommended staffing changes in this instance to meet the enhanced demands that from customers for the sewer lateral inspection program. Next slide. So what are the immediate impacts to revenues for water and wastewater because of COVID? Well, largely these impacts are coming from the commercial and industrial customer classes. As you can imagine, we have a significant amount of imported water demand every day in non-COVID times coming from tourism and from commuters during the work week. So our early indications of commercial water demand is that they're down in the 70 to 90% range. And that has kind of different impacts on water and wastewater, largely because of their rate structures. Water collects a good portion of their revenue from use or consumption charges. So as consumption drops, then we have more significant revenue drops than in wastewater, which has a kind of an even mix of fixed and volumetric charges. So these estimated impacts initially right now are about a $500,000 per month loss in water rate revenue and about a $200,000 per month loss in wastewater revenue. We would anticipate these losses to continue as long as the governor's stay-at-home order is in place. Now, when that order is eventually rescinded and the economy gradually rebounds, we expect this to decline and go back somewhat to a new normal level, but that would be over a few years at this time. And then we have some other less impactful declines in revenue. So capacity charges, which are tied to development to some degree, we would anticipate a lag in that revenue source. Service connections and high strength surcharges, which are collected in the wastewater fund. And primarily right now is portable restroom waste is a high strength surcharge. However, public events, of course, are being canceled. And so potentially having less of that high strength waste coming to the Ellisdale plant. Also, and we're fairly early on in this analysis, is getting a hold of what type of account delinquencies we're going to see and what type of non-payment will be coming from customers. Of course, we're offering support to our customers and payment plans, and we'll talk later in this presentation a little bit about how we can initiate a billing assistance program to go further. So next slide. So I'm going to walk you through a couple scenarios for water and wastewater on rates. And really the purpose of our cash flow model is to kind of understand capital expenditure, reserve, and long-term rates from changing a single variable. And that's changing the FY21 rate revenue. Rate revenues have a compounding effect over time. So as you can imagine, little changes right now have a large impact over a 10-year financial planning period. And you'll see some of that in the scenarios. The assumptions, and I just want to be clear on several assumptions that go into this. For water, we're assuming that we execute a $10 million desal grant. However, we will be bringing this item to council in about a month. There are some stipulations on the operation of the desal plant. We have to be sure that that's what the city would like to take on in exchange for the $10 million grant. We're also assuming we're going to execute a $1.5 million grant for advanced metering infrastructure. We've been awarded the grant, but we still have to go through the funding negotiation process. We're also still assuming that our electric costs increase by about 13% as a result of the CCE implementation. We're an industrial user, so we're seeing a little bit higher rate increases than our residential users. However, I understand that staff is looking into potentially changing that adoption timeline, and so that may change as well. Also, we're assuming that our staffing recommendations are approved for water and wastewater, as I explained earlier. And finally, that conservation is going to actually remain steady at about 30% in our planning period. As budgets tighten, so will their mindfulness of water use. So understandably, maybe some rebounds we were expecting will no longer be realized. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through this table of information, and at the top, what you see I've highlighted in red, we have these 5 different scenarios that we're going to walk through. And then on the left are kind of the different components of each of these scenarios. Our adoption timeline, the main variable that we're changing, the FY21 rate increase. Is there a water supply agreement in place? And really only our last scenario contemplates that. I show the average monthly bill increase for single family customers. What are the impacts to capital projects, reserve levels, and then the long-term outlook on rates. So we can certainly do smaller rate increases now, but oftentimes that's going to have an upward pressure on the long-term outlook for rate increases in each fund. So if we just go to the next slide, it'll be the first scenario. This is where we were just a couple months ago. We were going to adopt in September 6% rate increases. It's about a $7.50 increase per month on a single family residential bill. We had no reductions in our capital program, and we had pretty healthy reserves. We had reserves at about 100 to 20% of policy, and we were planning on using those to buffer any further rate increases in the next few years. Our long-term outlook for rates was about 3%. So once we get through the multi-year study, we were going to be able to do 3% rate increases for several to 5 to 7 years thereafter. Now, as we move into the kind of the immediate COVID impact scenario, we've delayed our adoption timeline. So now we need to move this back a couple months so we have the most information available before we adopt rates. So we're looking at an adoption in November 2020, but that would put rates in effect in about January 1, 2021. So it's important to understand already there will be no rate increase for the last half of this year. And if council chooses to do one, then it would be only a half year time at which that rate increase is in effect. Still looking at 6% rate increases. And really the only thing that changed in this scenario is if you look at our reserve levels, we've essentially used up all of our reserves to absorb the revenue reductions coming from the commercial class. Also, you see a slight uptick in our long-term outlook for rates. So we may need to actually do 4% rate increases instead of 3 as we go into these out years. So as we go to the middle scenario, the 3% rate increase, again, same adoption timeline. We are able to provide some rate relief to customers. So the bill is about half as much at $3.73 per month as an increase. However, we do see an immediate impact to our capital program. That's about a $5 million reduction in FY21 in the water main replacement program to balance reserves. So we're still at 100% of policy, but we're cutting about $5 million out of the water main program to make that work. And again, our long-term outlook increases to about 5% rate increases now as we go forward. I do want to open this up quickly for a moment to invite Matt Ward, the water system manager, to speak a little about our capital prioritization in terms of water main funding.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Good afternoon, Water Commissioners, or excuse me, Finance Committee, Chairman Friedman. I'm Matt Ward. I'm the acting Water System Manager, and wanted to go over a couple of significant items that are in the budget for water. The first one that you're well aware of is AMI, or Automated Metering Infrastructure. And AMI is a real important communication tool for our customers. And it's something that we've presented to you on in the past. A lot of positive momentum behind that project. We had a great pilot project and about a $1.5 billion grant for that. So we're working on that and moving ahead with it. Also, with water main replacement, obviously it's a really important project for the city. It's been very successful over the years. In 2018, we wanted to increase that funding for that project from 1% to 2% annually. And we're planning to work through the situation ahead. I think the proposals in front of you are pretty well thought out.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. So if we move to the next scenario, the no rate increase slide. This is where we put off any rate increase, and we come back for adoption in July of 2021, put rates in effect almost immediately. The monthly bill increase, of course, is no increase from where it is now. So that's kind of maximum relief in terms of rates in the near term. But at this point, and the water capital program has to take some significant cuts. And because of these compounding effects over time, likely what we're looking at are about 3 years of a $5 million cut to our water main replacement program each year. So $15 million total cut from the water capital program. We're also dipping into policy reserves to fund remaining capital projects and operational costs so about 5% dip into council policy. And long-term outlook for rates stays about the same. So it's about 5% rate increases in those out years. And then finally, if we look at this last scenario, this was what happens if we execute a water supply agreement with Montecito, but do no rate increase. Well, the water supply agreement has some pretty significant revenue impacts in just a couple year time. Everything is the same here, except the capital program kind of looks more like the 3% scenario. So we only have to do 1 year of capital program cuts. We replenish our reserves. We bring our reserves back up to council policy, and we kind of significantly reduce our outlook for rates in the long term. So we're back to looking at about 3 or 4% rate increases if we execute the WSA. So I know there's a lot there. We can pause for questions, but I'm happy just to barrel on with the wastewater scenarios. Okay.
Mr. Hamilton, if you could just continue on with wastewater so we can understand what the full bill pictures before we start asking questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So this table is just like the water table I presented. It has 4 scenarios, the same component pieces that we're looking at on the left-hand side here, timeline down to the long-term outlook. So our pre-COVID outlook is we've already adopted rates, a 3-year rate schedule. So we were planning on doing 5% come July 1, 2020. The monthly bill increase for single family residents would be approximately $2.70 from that 5% increase. Our capital program, no reductions, we continue as planned. However, as I mentioned earlier, we are at about 60% of policy as it stands right now in the wastewater fund, because we've used some of those capital project reserves to fund the Elistero design work, the Elistero electrical project design work. So the wastewater fund is in much less of a position right now to absorb revenue declines, either from decreased activity from the commercial sector or taking a pause on rates. Their reserve picture is much tighter. And the long-term outlook pre-COVID was about 5% increases to keep pace with capital investment in the wastewater system. Now, as we go to the COVID impacts, we're seeing kind of an immediate, if you go down to the capital program line item, what we're seeing is the loss of revenue from the commercial side is forcing us to defer the Braemar lift station rehabilitation project, which is a critical project. And I would like to just invite Amanda Flessy just to speak briefly about that and the SSO capital project line item.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Good afternoon, Chair Friedman and committee members. I just wanted to highlight the risk factors with cutting the wastewater capital fund. Braemar Lift Station is one of our critical lift stations. If you're not familiar with it, it is located on Cliff and Allen Road, right next to Arroyo Burro Creek. The lift station handles about 60% of the city's flow, and it pumps it, and that is the last stop that it pumps it to our Elistero Water Resource Center. So being able to defer this project is a critical infrastructure for us. This project will also address us being in a floodplain and any kind of sea level rise up to the 30-year sea level rise adaptation. So with that, on the 3% rate increase, if we cut even further from our adopted rates, we're going to be getting into our SSO. Our SSO is our sanitary sewer overflow funding. So that is really what our consent decree was kind of based on, and that is our rehab and our cleaning of our collection systems. So we would be dipping more into that kind of capital program. And that was actually really crucial. That program is really crucial in getting us out of the consent decree this year. So cutting that would put us a step back from the consent decree and put us a little bit more at risk.
Thank you, Ms. Flessy. Yeah, and the only comment I would make about the 3% scenario is if you look at the long-term outlook at this point, unless we want to make long-term cuts to the wastewater capital program, we're likely doing 6% rate increases for several years, just to replenish our council policy reserves and keep pace with investment. And then finally, if we just go to the last option here of no rate increases, I do want to note we do have to take some council action because rates are already adopted. They will automatically go into effect. So if we do want to do a 3% or 0% rate increase in wastewater, we will need to adjust the fee resolution. There is not a public noticing requirement because we would be adopting rates that are less than what has been noticed to the public last year. As Ms. Flessy mentioned, now we're looking at a couple year cuts, about $1.5 million total in the sanitary sewer overflow compliance project. We're still not at council policy. We're about 70% of policy. And really in the long term, we're doing 6%. And even then, we may still have to scale back the capital program to some degree just to have some reserves in the bank and also to be able to cover standard inflationary cost increases. So if we go to the next slide, kind of putting it all together and what you've heard about our scenarios, you're looking here, the kind of stack bar chart on the left shows these different components of your current utility bill from the city. So blue is water, green is wastewater, and that brown is solid waste. So the total bill you see is a $227.61. Now, I think staff's proposal at this time, and understandably, there's a lot of moving pieces. As Ms. Tomaszewski said, we're getting new information every day, and we're updating our projections as we see it. But based on what we presented in terms of the capital expenditure impacts from these different rate adoption scenarios, staff is looking at a 3% increase in water, continuing with the 5% increase for wastewater. And if you look at the increase that was presented by Ms. Irely, the bill would increase to about $237.53 a month for a kind of typical single family residence. That equates to about a 4.4% increase overall for fiscal year 21. And go to the next slide. So I'm going to end on a couple of slides just looking at the comparison of our water rates. So this is the comparison of a single family residential customer from the city, Goleta Water District, Montecito Water District, and Carpinteria Valley Water District. If you look at these different uses, so we have light blue is kind of low water use, dark blue is moderate water use, and that red is high water use. Santa Barbara has the lowest rates for low water users. Although Goleta looks lower in this chart, they recently dropped their drought surcharge, but along with that had to cut their significantly cut their capital program. So we imagine when they adopt rates for fiscal year 21, that City of Santa Barbara will have the lowest rates for low water users still. The next slide. And then looking at wastewater charges compared to our South Coast neighboring agencies, again, the City of Santa Barbara has some of the lowest, has the lowest wastewater rates for low water users. And then we're in the pack when you're using about 10 HCF, and it flatlines after that because we only charge for a portion of water use. And finally, we go to the last slide. So what are we doing right now with billing assistance? Well, we do have some tools in place to assist customers right now. So we're asking customers that if they feel that they're going to be unable to pay their bill, that they reach out as soon as possible, and we can discuss payment plans to keep them paying their bill and keep them current. We do have Spanish-speaking utility billing staff. We encourage you to call the number that's on the slide. Also, there is an exemption to the UUT, so low-income customers who are qualifying can have their 6% UUT tax waived on the water, wastewater, and solid waste bill. And then in addition, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we have contracted with our consultant to provide a summary on how we would implement a billing assistance program. So what kind of discount would that look like? Initially, this was going to happen after water rates was adopted and wouldn't go into place until a couple of years from now at a minimum as we got the program up and running. But we've kind of flip-flopped the priority workload for our consultant, and we've expedited this work effort. So they are currently working on their technical report on different elements of how we would offer even further discounts to low-income or customers in need. There are a good amount of moving components to that. So administration, what's the administrative burden? How do we fund a program like this? Rate revenues are restricted in their use by Proposition 218. So we have to find non-rate revenues that can fund a billing assistance program, and that can be difficult. What is the customer eligibility, and what would the discount structure look like? And so those are some of the things we're looking at right now in terms of a billing assistance program. I believe that concludes my presentation. Maybe one more slide. Excuse me. So we do have a couple of next steps. Just we'll be giving our department budget presentation on May 27th to City Council and looking for further direction on rates. And then in June, if we do have to take any action on wastewater rates, we'll be doing that with the adoption of the budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Ms. Irely, for your presentations. I do have a couple of questions. I'll start off and then turn over to my colleagues. You kind of answered them in that last part, but I'll kind of start with Mr. Hamilton. In terms of potential payment options, payment plans, or waiving of the fees, and what is the actual outreach plan to inform customers that they have these options?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. So we are in the very early stages of looking at this program. As I mentioned, we initially intended to do this in a couple of years' time, and so we're in a little bit of a sprint right now to bring this, but it's an important time, and we should be in that type of sprint. I think initially we would consider automatically enrolling customers that are in the UUT exemption immediately in the water discount program. So if you're enrolled in the UUT, you would immediately be enrolled in ours, and we would just notify them that they're receiving a further discount. Of course, we'd also use all the channels that the city has available to make customers aware. I think one of the concerns we have is eligibility. Typically, these low-income programs are based on your prior year tax information. So you may have been fully employed in 2019 and be ineligible based on that information, but we'd want to open that up to people are experiencing very recent hardship. And so I think that's also a concern of ours. Mr. Hagmark?
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton, Chair, committee members. I just wanted to also let you know, we have been doing weekly updates to the community, letting them know that we are here to assist them. So we are trying to get that message out, and it just starts with a phone call. We need them to reach out to us. We can't help them if we don't know. And so I think we have some tools. The other things we have at our discretion too is helping them to reduce their water usage. You know, if someone is struggling to pay their bill, you know, how important is that lawn? You know, maybe it's time to stop watering that lawn. Maybe it's time to let, you know, certain things we don't want to let go. Maybe those trees need to stay, but maybe stop watering the lawn could save them, you know, $100 a month. So, you know, our water conservation team is here as well to help them with maybe helping them think critically about their water usage at home that maybe matches up with what they can afford. So
that got to
my
next question, Mr. Hagmark. I think you're kind of going in there was what's the plan to inform customers of their ability to optimize services? Because in the staff report, it mentioned that that's one of the keys to this is that to optimize your service can reduce your actual costs. So it seems like you're working to get that information out so you know who's interested and who could do that, if I'm understanding you correctly.
That's correct, and Ms. Irely is doing the same. If there's questions, maybe there's a chance you could reduce your trash service as well. It really depends on what kind of service you're currently having, but I think it all starts with a phone call, and we've got staff standing by to help and trained to help, and so give us a call.
So I got two more questions. The remainder is on the Braemar pump station. Being that 60% of our effluent goes through there, and if we were to reduce, or when you talked about delaying the Braemar pump station, what exactly did you mean by delaying with the 3% versus if we didn't do any funding at the 0%, what would that delay mean? Because they're going to be two different as I understand it. So I'm just trying to get that, what the difference is between the delays based on the percentages.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Let me clarify. So Braemar was scheduled to go out to bid in June. So it's ready to basically be constructed. I added one little element to make sure that the sea level rise was addressed adequately. And that's the last element, and we're ready to go out to bid. With the revenue loss that we have already incurred or are anticipating to incur at the end of the fiscal year, and the revenue loss with next fiscal year, we're unsure that we're even going to have enough money to fund the construction of Braemar. And so that's what I meant, that Braemar will have to be delayed until further notice. We are looking at possibly doing this as an SRF loan, but that won't come until December. That's when the SRF loan the applications are due. And then we are also looking at any kind of stimulus package for shovel-ready projects. This is a great example of a shovel-ready project that was put on hold specifically because of COVID, and it is a direct impact to the community.
I think that clarifies it. So any further reductions in rates would push that out unless we got some type of funding to come in. So by doing zero, it would push it out even farther than we would think. So
correct.
Thank you. The last question I have is for Ms. Irely on the Tahigas project. Within some of the city costs, there's our programs. Could you, for my colleagues and the public, identify what those programs are, such as solid waste, hazardous waste, homeless camp, those types of things that it funds? So it's not as if we could just cut those programs. There's real community benefits with those programs. If you could just give a quick overview of some of those programs that are funded.
So thank you, Chair Freeman. That's correct. We also have a contract with the county that is specifically for regional the household hazardous waste facility, which is up by UCSB, green waste collection and processing, Christmas tree collection processing, and then our overall messaging to the community for sort of like our seamless waste reduction messages.
And our homeless encampment cleanups funded in part by this?
Our homeless encampment cleanups are built into our rates already. So the proposal is to maintain that level of funding this year at fiscal year 20 rates, with the exception of the additional code enforcement officer, and that's the partial increase you see in the third line for the Clean SB program.
Great, thank you very much. I see Councilmember Harmon, you're up.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. You asked most of my questions. I just have a couple. The first, I think, is for you, Mr. Friedman. Are we planning to take action today, or is this just receiving the report on this item?
Today, it's just receiving a report, so there's no official action we need to take today.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And the first, I'm sorry, my notes were a little bit confusing on this. On the recommendation that staff is making in connection with the water rate increases, you guys are recommending the 3%, hi, Mr. Hamilton, which was the middle in that awesome table you made, the 3% was the middle option. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, Chair Friedman, Committee Member Harmon, that is correct.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I wrote that down correctly. And then my only other question is with regard to the wastewater rates. I think it was mentioned that a big part of the capital improvements that we need to make are connected to the consent decree and making sure that we fulfill our obligations under that decree. Are the capital improvements ongoing, and what's the status of that consent decree? If it's scheduled to be lifted, are we still anticipating significant capital outlays in connection with it? Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair Friedman, Committee Member Harmon. It does make sense. So we're scheduled to go to Council on May 12th to provide you with an update of our collection system and the consent decree, letting you know that we just got out of the consent decree as of March 31st. And it's because of the consent decree and all the programs that we started in our collection system is why we have been so successful to get out of the decree. However, we do plan on keeping a lot of those programs going because it has really significantly impacted our sewer spills, and from 40 all the way to 3. We had 3 last year. And so it is a definite impact to our community's health and safety, and reducing it really does put a risk and a hardship on our collection system. We are nowhere near where we need to be as far as rehabbing all of our old pipes and making sure that they're secure and stable. but we are well on our way and we have a great program, and just reducing it would impact and increase our risks.
Okay, I'm just trying, so I guess what I'm hearing from you is that staff doesn't want to reduce it, but it's not necessarily that that these programs necessitate ongoing investment like in this exact fiscal year to keep ourselves from getting another consent decree. Your position is just that if we don't continue to invest, there may be another one down the line.
Correct. If we don't continue to invest and we start seeing spills increase, then that's probably a red flag, and we will probably be seeing another lawsuit down the line.
Okay, understood. I would just say, or actually now's not the time for comments, but I will hold that. Appreciate it. Thank you, Chair Friedman.
Councilmember Gutierrez, do you have any questions?
No questions at this moment.
Thank you. So unless something has changed, I don't see any members of the public wishing to comment on this. So we can go to comments from my colleagues. Councilmember Harmon, you said you had some comments, and now would be the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First, I'll just say I'm generally very supportive of this approach. It's clear that you have all put a lot of thought and energy into trying to balance these competing interests, burdens on community members, along with necessary improvements and investments into our infrastructure. So as a general matter, I'm really appreciative, particularly really appreciative of the efforts that you all are undertaking to communicate with people about the opportunities for them to get help on their bills. That's, I mean, it really is, deserves recognition. So I thank you for that. I generally feel that the approach you've taken, again, is reasonable. My only hesitation really is that the burdens that folks are going to be facing, particularly the longer that this shutdown extends, are going to be so extreme that if we have any capacity, and I'm really seeing the only place that we might have any wiggle room at all is with the wastewater approach. Anything that we can do, even if it means pressing pause on some of these things that we know in 2 years we're going to have to reinitiate, I would be interested in hearing a little bit more information about what that's going to look like. Certainly understanding and agreeing that we don't want to put ourselves in a position for another consent decree. But if there is an opportunity to be a bit flexible there and say, we've made the necessary changes that we need to make under that decree for now, and we can wait a year or 2 years, and it's not, you know, it's a calculated risk maybe to ease some burdens, even if it's just a couple dollars a month, that is a big deal to a lot of people. I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about what that looks like when this comes to the full council, but generally I'm supportive, and I think that you have all tried to be very thorough and reasonable, which I really appreciate.
My mic there. Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. Councilmember Gutierrez, do you have any comments? Thank you. I do have a few comments. I want to echo my colleagues that this is just an unfortunate circumstance we're in economically for our residents and in particular our businesses. And to be contemplating rate increases is a very difficult, not a position any of us want to be in. However, when you look at the very little actual discretionary revenue that we have, it's very limited. A lot of these are contracts that were entered into years ago. And the reality is a lot of this has to do with capital investment, that if we don't invest now, we could have higher costs later, as we saw with the consent decree. And one of the things we do need to consider is one of those higher costs is if we started having more spills, how that would affect, especially if we had to close beaches as we're trying to bring in our tourism back later this year and into next year, how those all implicate. So there's a lot of unknowns there. We want to be known for having pristine waters, those types of things as is part of the Santa Barbara brand as we're refocusing ourselves. And that takes capital investment. And then we also see that the more we delay now, the greater the increase would be later on. And it's all likelihood going to be an economic uncertainty, perhaps recession a year or 2 years from now. So an example of how this impacted was brought up today of these types of impacts was back in the 2017-18 fiscal year, is that when the previous council chose to use reserves to fund a portion of the tipping fee increases at Tahigas, those reserves were spent down, even though those were ongoing costs. And then when it came back a couple of years later, and the big bump came from $102 up to $150, we also had to make up the 99 to the 102, and we had to replenish the reserves. So what would have been about a 12 or 13% increase to pay for the capital cost of construction ended up being closer to a 16%. And 12% is not great by any means, but to have a 16% on there. And we're now feeling the effects today because we haven't had the opportunity to replenish the reserves, which could have impacted some of the rates that we're seeing today. We just don't have those reserves. So when we delay our capital, we end up incurring future costs down the line that are more comprehensive and expensive. In particular, I also want to stress that I think the Braemar lift station project is a priority. I know we're looking to try to fund it. So to the extent that we can pursue those state revolving funds and other resources to get that up and going, it mitigates a lot of risk that we have. So with that, I do want to see the numbers that you come up with or the scenarios you come up with in response to Councilwoman Harmon's questions. I do appreciate that staff has been able to reduce some of the impact or the rate increases that were originally proposed on this, and that we are looking to minimize the impacts, especially for businesses and our lower income residents. So with that, I don't think you need a motion or anything further. So unless there is any other comments on these items, I will close these items. And then lastly, I did forget one thing, was any general public comment on anything not on the agenda. There wasn't any, but I had to open and close it. So with that, this meeting is adjourned.